studying psychedelics right now.
Did that also cause you to go vegan?
No. Interesting. I was vegetarian for a while at the time, but that's a good question because it's complicated, to think about, well, what do I want to do with my diet? But no, I'm not vegan. I'm not even vegetarian right now. So, but obviously that's a personal decision that everyone has to make. And for me, there is a distinction between eating to live and survive and using animals for research. So that's where I do the line.
No doubt. You're talking to two meat eaters. I was just curious if that was something that came about from those experiences. And I think, in my ayahuasca experiences, that's kind of the same sort of thoughts that I've had in terms of, having this shift in consciousness to kind of better the world and to not take too much and do your part and pick up trash when you see it or call someone out when you see them throw something on the ground, those sorts of things. So I was just curious if it had gotten that deep with you or not.
Yeah, it certainly, it had me questioning all that. It got me to examine that much more closely than I had before. So, yeah, ended up being an omnivore still. So, yeah.
One question I have for you, has there been any headway made on legalization trying to happen with ibogaine, or is there just nothing going on with that right now in the United States that you know of?
It's been really sporadic, but there are some efforts underway, and so in Vermont, all these New England states, actually I think Maryland also, there's been some movement there towards having legislation that would allow for either research or making ibogaine available therapeutically. But Vermont, I think, was the state that really spearheaded it. So the state level is where things have been happening in this country. There's a group called Vermonters for Ibogaine Research, and they managed to get a couple of bills to a committee. I think it was like the subcommittee on health and human services, something like that. But the bills haven't made it past committee. Their governor, the governor of Vermont, actually was one of the people who was instrumental in getting that to that point. That is, that people were noticing that there was something called ibogaine that might be useful to combat the opioid crisis. So they got a couple of bills up to committee that didn't make it past committee. New York has also had, I think, one or two bills that have been written up but haven't been passed. So, on the state level, things have been happening, but very sporadically. I think in Vermont, though, last time they had something come up to the House subcommittee was probably about 4 years ago. And there hasn't been a lot happening. So there is some activity. And you may be aware that back in the 80s and 90s, there was very strong activism in the U.S., and there was some activism also in the Netherlands, mostly supported by groups of people who are addicted to opioids, to get some kind of to allow for research or to allow ibogaine to be made available to people. So they, back in the, I think it was mid 80s to late 80s, activists. There's a guy named Dana Beal who's still working in activism for cannabis and for ibogaine, and some other activists in New York City who had kind of an alliance with a group called ACT UP, which is the alliance. It's the alliance to. It's coalition to unleash power. A coalition to unleash power. They were They were all about getting treatments for AIDS, in the mid '80s, and there was some cooperation between ibogaine activists and the AIDS activists because of the shared the fact that HIV was being passed along through needle use as well as through sex. So back then there was a lot of activism, at least in New York City, but there hasn't been that much here recently. I keep thinking that there's going to be a moment where there's going to be a tipping point where suddenly people will find out more about ibogaine, because the moment right now is that we've been in this severe opioid crisis, which has just been getting worse and worse, and we don't have the resources to deal with it. And now we have a couple of studies that show that ibogaine is effective. So yeah, I keep thinking there's going to be a moment where public awareness is going to tip the scales, or enough people will start noticing that there's scientific evidence that it works, and that people will say, hey, we're demanding that this be made available. It's happening a little bit, like in Vermont and other states, but there hasn't been I think it would probably take a pretty sweeping a sea change in people's perspectives.
Yeah, it's interesting, living in here in Denver, where we back in May we voted to decriminalize psilocybin and made that happen. And
congratulations for that.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I got jury duty because of it.
Yeah. Wow.
But I think that's what we're seeing is that, and I think they did some stuff in Oakland where they did the same thing and had ayahuasca, and I think ibogaine was in there, or iboga, one of the two was in there. And knowing how much of a problem it is in Vermont, and even where we're from in New Jersey, how bad it is, it's at a point, like you said, in 2019 where, through less than 6 degrees of separation, you are connected to someone who is either going through it or has lost someone. And I think it's going to have to take place at the local level, in the town or in the city where they vote, and then it spreads like that. And it's going to get to the point where the federal government isn't going to have a choice, because every state in the union is going to have their own, cannabis laws or psychedelic laws, and they're just going to look foolish if they continue to, how can you say X, Y, and Z are Class 1, Schedule 1 substances when, things like cocaine and heroin aren't on those, aren't those Schedule 1 drugs.
Yeah. I agree. I think it's going to eventually shift for a lot of different psychedelic substances and for cannabis. Yeah.
And
do you have any current studies you're doing right now at UC San Diego that you're holding?
No. I should point out that the research I've done with ibogaine was not actually through UC San Diego, but on top of my work there at the university. So I'm an academic administrator there. I'd like to be doing the research there at the university, but I don't have a research appointment there at the university, so I can't even submit something to the IRB for approval, to the review board for approval. So the study that I did out of Mexico that MAPS supported, that was sponsored. That went through the IRB and the California Institute for Integral Studies, and sometimes people with the psychedelics research, if they can't get approval at their university, they'll go to a private IRB to get approval, which you can also do. So, yeah. So to get back to your question though about current research, I am actually in between research right now. So there's something that's in the works, which would be to look at look more in depth at the psychological processes and the psycho-spiritual transformation that's taking place for people. And as I mentioned earlier, that's my primary interest right now. Ibogaine is learning more about that. so that's one thing that's potentially in the works. But the next thing that really needs to happen for advancing ibogaine treatment is to have a phase 1 study, which phase 1 is looking at the dose escalation and looking at safety and seeing what the responses are to ibogaine in so-called normal populations. There's been some work done with the dose escalation. Deborah Mash at the University of Miami did a dose escalation study with opioid-dependent, I think it was opioid-dependent people. She also looked at cocaine-dependent people. But that study wouldn't be one that could be used for FDA approval, I don't think, because it's not with a quote-unquote normal population.
Based on your research and your studies and everything that you've seen and observed, if it were a perfect world and you could create like a clinical setting to optimize the highest success rate, what would that entail? What would that look like?
Well, for the treatment, of course, number one would be having the treatment site be in a place where people can get to it easily. People who need the treatment can get to it easily. But there is actually a treatment manual. There are a few treatment manuals that have been written up. One of them was done by Howard Lotsoff and a colleague back in the mid-'90s. But much more recently, a group called the Global Ibogaine Therapy Alliance made a treatment manual for best practices for treatment to minimize the risks and to maximize the therapeutic value, but mostly to minimize the risks. So to minimize the risks, you really need to have a physician or somebody who's trained in emergency medicine on hand. You need to make sure you do heart monitoring, make sure you have done an EKG before treatment, and also look at liver enzymes to see if people are potentially there are some people who are slow metabolizers of ibogaine, and that would indicate that they should have a lower dose because they're metabolizing it more slowly. And so you can do an enzyme assay to figure out if someone's a fast or slow metabolizer of ibogaine. That should always be done. And there should also be preparation. So partly to manage expectations. Are you going into the treatment expecting that ibogaine is going to cure your addiction? Are you going in thinking that it's going to give you a chance to work with some of the underlying issues of your addiction because it's going to give you a chance to stop using? So I think managing expectations is worthwhile, but also giving people a good sense of what they are getting themselves into, what the risks and possible benefits are, what's going to possibly happen during treatment, and also preparing them for what's going to happen after treatment. So let them know that, and I've heard this from many people who have had ibogaine treatment for opioid use, and that is the ibogaine isn't going to cure your addiction. It's going to open you up to allowing yourself to do that work, but you have to do that work, and so it's really up to you to find a way to integrate the experiences and to work with the opportunity that ibogaine gives you when you get that treatment. So then obviously after the treatment, there should be some kind of integration work. And so I think people who are well trained in working with people who use psychedelics, so people who are they could be a trip sitter perhaps, but importantly, I think there should be somebody who helps you integrate the experiences. Not everyone has visions, and not everyone has keen insights when they're on ibogaine, but they should have somebody who is able to help them integrate whatever experiences they've had, and they should have somebody who is a trained an addiction counselor who is open to having the